Alright, welcome back, Sebastian here. So time for my power rankings for the 2025 Italian Grand Prix. So starting right away with driver number 20, and this week that is Yuki Tsunoda. Now for Tsunoda, a pretty rough weekend. Qualified 9th, out-qualified by his teammate by about 7 tenths of a second, while his teammate was on pole position. Now of course, end of Q3 was the first driver to go out on his final run. So understandable that he might, not have the perfect lap without having, not having a tow, but still 7 tenths is, a tad too much around Monza where there's so few corners. Then in the Grand Prix, pitted relatively early from the medium tire onto the hard, and then had a really poor second stint of the Grand Prix in a race where it looked like he should have been able to score some points, an 8th place, a 9th place finish, and to date, a 9th place finish remains his highest finish in a Grand Prix, which is just not acceptable in a Red Bull. But at the end of the race, finishes 13th, a bit of clumsy contact with Liam Lawson, almost Perez-esque there, clashing with Lawson while driving a Red Bull. And to make matters worse, he finished 80 seconds off his teammate Verstappen, who I can assure you is not very low, very much not low on these power rankings. Alright, moving on to number 19, and that is Liam Lawson. Now for Lawson, qualified dead last in 20th, a pretty big mistake. Big snapper oversteer, went a bit wide on the gravel, going through the Lesmos on his final run in Q1. Ill-qualified by his teammate Isack Hadjar by 3.5 tenths of a second, which is, much bigger than you would ideally like, especially given that this is a track where Lawson has driven before in F1, and for Hadjar, he has of course not driven this track at all. In terms of the strategy, honestly, it was not that bad. The race pace, raw race pace itself, I think was not horrible. I think pitted maybe a little bit too early, going from soft to hard. And to be honest, his teammate did have the better strategy. So again, that makes up for some of the pace difference between the two of them. But that being said, had a bit of a needless clash with Tsunoda, of course, the driver in 20th. And again, no penalty there. I think it was a bit of a racing incident between the two of them. So again, definitely not helpful for the power rankings. And at the end of the race, comes home in 14th place. And his teammate went from pit lane to point. So definitely showed that there was quite a bit of good pace in the car. Lawson just not able to extract it this weekend. Now, number 18th is Lance Stroll. Set a new F1 record this weekend with the fastest ever interview in a post-race. If you don't know what I'm talking about, go check on the F1 YouTube channel and look at the post-race interviews and look at Stroll's. Qualified, let's see, where did he qualify? I think he qualified 18th or so, but ended up starting 16th. Out-qualified by 2.9 tenths to his teammate Fernando Alonso. Gap a little bit bigger than you would ideally want around Monza, and one of the, I would say one of the bigger ones this past weekend. And given that Alonso got the car into Q3, I think Q2 was the bare minimum for Stroll, and he failed to do that. In terms of the race, did a bit of a Hail Mary strategy similar to the two McLaren drivers. Just went out as long as he possibly could on the hard tires, I should say, and unfortunately it didn't really work out, and ends up finishing dead last in the Grand Prix. So I think Grand Prix itself not too bad, didn't really do anything wrong, not great either. But other drivers who are also doing similar strategies, starting on the hards, switching to a softer tire towards the end, like Hadjar, started behind him, ended up in the points. So again, that definitely shows that I think there was a bit more pace there for Stroll. Now, moving on to number 17, I'm going with Esteban Ocon. Ocon qualified in 15th place, out-qualified by his rookie teammate, Behrman, by a margin of 2.6 tenths of a second. Margin that is, again, really too big around Monza, and the fact that it was against a rookie teammate for, a 7-8 year veteran like Ocon is, pretty unacceptable, I would say. He's definitely been struggling, I would say, in qualifying this year. Don't know if it's the fact that Behrman's just a better qualifier than him, or the fact that he's taking a while to get embedded in the Haas, or what exactly is going on here. But really, for a driver of Ocon's caliber, his experience, he should be doing better than that over one lap. In the race, had a bit of a clumsy incident with Stroll. I felt the penalty was a little bit harsh. I think, to be honest, it was just a racing incident. But Ocon was given a 5-second penalty for pushing Stroll off track. So again, that definitely did not help his ranking either. So 17th it is for Ocon. And again, similar strategy to Stroll. Hail Mary on the hards and didn't go so well and ends up in 15th. And actually somehow ends up ahead despite the fact that he had the penalty. So I guess a bit better than Stroll this past weekend. Oh dear. Now, number 16 is a driver who I think with much fanfare, I should say, of course moved to Williams this year. And it's kind of turning into a bit of a disaster of a season. Nothing seems to go right for Sainz. Some things completely out of his control. Some things, I would say, definitely within his control. And the incident this past weekend with Behrman, I think, was definitely within his control, even though he was not the driver receiving the penalty this time. I do think that Sainz could have definitely judged this a little bit better. Qualifying honestly went pretty well. Qualified 13th, out-qualified Albon by 500ths of a second. Williams has unfortunately kind of fallen a bit away from being at the top of the midfield in terms of one-lap pace. The race pace is still really good, and Albon showed that the pace was really, really strong this past weekend. But unfortunately for Sainz, had a bit of a coming together with Behrman. I really felt like it was a racing incident. The penalty on Behrman was quite a bit harsh, and given that Behrman hasn't showed up in my power rankings, that kind of reflects that there. But that being said, for Sainz, I think was a bit too aggressive coming across Behrman. Should have left more space there, even if you are the driver ahead at the apex. The car on the inside can't just vanish, is what I said in my review yesterday. And so for Sainz, even though qualifying went well, I think he has to take some responsibility for that incident, and it likely cost him a point as he finished. Where is he? He finished 11th in the Grand Prix. He lost a position in that incident with Behrman to Hadjar. So without that, almost certainly finishes in the points. So yeah, not great weekend for Sainz. Now, number 15 is the driver he clashed with, and the only reason I really put Behrman ahead of Sainz is that I did think that Behrman's qualifying was a little bit more impressive than Sainz's, qualifying Ocon by the 2.6 margin that he did. For Behrman, qualified 11th, just missing out on Q3, almost out-qualifying Lando Norris in the process. Very, very close fight between the two of them, and of course, Norris had a very good final sector to kind of put that all away. Could have been a very, very different Grand Prix if Norris had been knocked out in Q2. But for Behrman, qualifying, I think really, really good job. In the race, I think decent race pace, undercut Tsunoda in the Red Bull, which I think is pretty good. And again, looked like he could have gotten some points, and then unfortunately had the clash with Sainz. And I do think, a more experienced driver in that situation might have realized, this is probably not a move that's going to be on. I should probably just back out of this so I can live to fight another day, whereas kind of stay where I am and get rammed by Sainz. So I do think, he has to take some responsibility for it. But that being said, I think the 10-second penalty was a bit too harsh. All right, number 14 is Kimi Antonelli. So for Antonelli, I think really the reason he's as high as he is in this ranking is because he had a pretty good qualifying. Qualified 6th, out-qualified by his teammate Russell, though by only 0.04 of a second. So pretty decent job there over one lap in Monza this time out. In the race, a really rough start, loses I think 4 to 5 positions there, and that really put his race on the back foot. Decent recovery drive, overtook Tsunoda, overcut a bunch of other drivers who he ended up losing positions to, I think including Bortoleto, and then I think in the meanwhile Alonso's car was failing him, so I guess that's another position there. But a bit of a needless penalty in the clash with Albon, and that of course dropped him a position from P8 to P9 on the road, and of course also lost, I believe, P7 in the Drivers' Championship standings to Albon. So again, not a great home weekend for Antonelli, and this really caps up a European leg of the season to forget for the Mercedes driver, where he only scored a single Grand Prix point, and that was a 10th place in Hungary. Now, 13th this past weekend was a driver who did not participate in the Grand Prix, and that is Nico Hülkenberg. Originally qualified 12th, out-qualified by his teammate Bortoleto by 1.6 of a second. I would say that, that's an unacceptable margin the way that I was talking about with Ocon, but I really think that Bortoleto is a really, really special driver. One F2 as a rookie, one F3 as a rookie. Seeing things that we haven't really seen from a rookie in a midfield, I'm going to say in the midfield, since Leclerc in 2019, or in 2018, I should say. So I think really, really impressive job by Bortoleto, and I think with hindsight, in a couple years' time, I think we will look back at this year between Hülkenberg and Bortoleto in a slightly more positive light for Hülkenberg than we're looking at it right now. Again, that's just my opinion. That's my 2 cents. But again, I do think a little bit of an underperformance there in qualifying by Hulkenberg. And then, of course, didn't start the race. So 13th in my power rankings, it is. All right, number 12 is Franco Colapinto, in the exact same spot he was last weekend. I think, honestly, a pretty decent weekend by the Argentinian, kind of starting to get his season back on track. But unfortunately for him, it's coming at a time where the Alpine is basically the worst car on the grid. And I think worst car in a way that it's not even worse and sometimes able to fight with the cars in front of it. It's basically consistently 10th place almost every single weekend now. In the Grand Prix, qualified 17th, out-qualified his teammate Gasly by a tenth of a second, but finished ahead of his teammate, behind his teammate. Had team orders basically asking, the team asked him to let Gasly pass. And so I do think the race pace itself was a little bit weaker this time out compared to Gasly. And so even though he out-qualified him, I am putting him just behind his more experienced teammate. Now for Gasly, qualified 19th, started from the pit lane and then ends up finishing 16th. So let's see, about 3 or 4 positions difference between the two of them, depending on how you want to count the pit lane start. And again, Gasly still finishes ahead of him. So I think because of that, just because of the pit lane start and still finishing ahead of Colapinto, I do have Gasly ahead of Colapinto. But very easily you could, I guess, argue putting them the other way around. I think they're both generally getting close to the maximum out of that Alpine car. But unfortunately, the car is just so bad that it's still not a very good finishing result of 17th for Colapinto, 16th for Gasly. So into the top 10 we go, and number 10 is Isack Hadjar. Now for Hadjar, he went from the pit lane to P10, and so in a nutshell, that would be a pretty good job. But, unfortunately, I think he kind of made a muffin out of qualifying. I think there was definitely at least bare minimum Q2 pace there. So I do think Hadjar underperformed there. He was also on the best strategy. And so taking that into account, I do think he had a good weekend overall. Really good Saturday, really good Sunday, poor Saturday, but optimal strategy in there as well. So I think 10th place, almost average, is a pretty good spot for Hadjar. Of course, out-qualified his teammate by 3.6 tenths. So again, decent job there, but I think that was mostly down to Lawson having a shocker in qualifying with that mistake than it was about Hadjar putting an excellent lap together. And yeah, pretty good overall recovery for Hadjar, really strong race pace in a car that obviously he's having a pretty good time driving. And when I think at this point he inevitably ends up driving for the Red Bull in 2026, we shall see how he does in the meat grinder. That is the Red Bull number 2 seat. All right, number 9 is Alex Albon. So for Albon, qualified 14th, out-qualified by his teammate Sainz by 0.05 of a second. And then in the race, really decent result, recovery drive to 7th. Again, a bit similar to Hadjar on the optimal strategy, starting on the hard, switching to mediums, with about 15 laps to go in the race. Benefit a little bit from a couple of the clashes going on around him, from Alonso also dropping out of the race, being on the optimal strategy. I thought it was a pretty good race from Albon, but still being out-qualified by Sainz kind of restricts him from being a bit higher up. And likewise, being on the optimal strategy also restricts him in a way, because it does show that, if you're on the best strategy, of course, I'm trying to take out of account, take luck and, having things like optimal strategy into account when I do my power rankings to try to, rank performance and not just, luck. And luck is something that we'll be talking about when we get to the 2 McLaren drivers, of course. Now, number 8 is Lewis Hamilton. So for Hamilton, qualified P5, I believe, and then, of course, had to start 10th because of the grid penalty last time out. Out-qualified by his teammate Leclerc by 1.1 tenth of a second, 1.2 tenths of a second. So honestly, not a bad qualifying by Hamilton, 1.2 tenths to his teammates, not so bad. And then recovered 2 points in the Grand Prix, which I thought was pretty reasonable. I think overall a solid, decent Grand Prix, but still I felt pretty clearly the second best Ferrari driver this weekend. So for me, 8th on my power rankings. All right, number 7 is Gabriel Bortoleto. So for Bortoleto, qualified 7th, out-qualified his teammate Hulkenberg by 1.6 tenths of a second. Best of the rest in qualifying. In the race, decent Grand Prix, got undercut, or basically got beaten in the pit lane, I should say, by Alonso. So it looked like he lost a position there, would have been on pace for a P9 finish. got overcut by Albon, but still I think a pretty decent race. I think the race pace will come with time, the racecraft as well, but still I think a really good job done by Bortoleto to come home in 8th place in the Grand Prix. Alright, number 6 is Oscar Piastri. So for Piastri, qualified 3rd, out-qualified by his teammate Norris by about 1/10 of a second. Definitely felt like he was a bit on the back foot all weekend. And again, some people have been saying, oh, it's because he lost FP1 to his teammate Dunn, or to the young driver Dunn. I don't really think that's much of an excuse, especially on a track that Piastri clearly knows so pretty well, and also given that he's done this track so many times in the past already, and given it's a pretty simple track as well. But still qualified 3rd, and then of course finished the Grand Prix in 3rd. Could have finished the Grand Prix in 2nd if McLaren had not asked the 2 drivers to swap positions. I don't think that would have really changed much on my power rankings, as it really felt like Norris was the stronger driver in the race whatsoever, regardless of that. Of course, Piastri lost positions at the start to Leclerc, lost time overtaking him, and then of course didn't really bite into Norris's advantage over him with that consistently throughout the Grand Prix. So I felt like he was generally second best McLaren driver this weekend by, I would say, the biggest margin that we've seen since Austria, I would say. Alright, number 5 is Fernando Alonso. Really solid Grand Prix for the Spaniard. Qualified 8th, out-qualified Stroll by 2.9 of a second. Got the hunk of junk that is the Aston Martin in a straight line into Q3. I honestly thought that this was going to be a disastrous weekend for for Aston, and I expected a double Q1 knockout, given the last time we were at a relatively low downforce, low drag circuit. The Aston Martins had a shocker of a weekend, being the slowest car by a country mile, and given that we know that the relative inefficiencies of the aerodynamic package of the car, I expected a similar weekend this time out. But Alonso, excellent job in qualifying, got himself up into P8. I think, qualified 9th, started P8 with Hamilton's penalty, and then really solid Grand Prix until his car broke, going over a suspension, the curse. Alonso's bad luck continues again. And so for Alonso, even though he doesn't get any points and retired with a mechanical failure, I think 5th is still a really appropriate spot for him. Now moving into 4th, I'm going to go with George Russell. So for Russell, kind of a lonely race, kind of in no man's land. Qualified 5th, out-qualified his teammate by 400s, but really I felt like there wasn't a whole lot more in the car, just too inefficient. And then drove to a really solid 5th place, beat Hamilton's Mercedes. I felt like the Ferraris were slightly faster than the Mercedes this weekend, so to be able to beat Hamilton's Ferrari, I should say, of course, we've said Hamilton's Mercedes for the last decade or so. But yes, Hamilton's Ferrari was again a pretty good result for Russell, so I think 4th place on my power rankings is a good spot for him. All right, number 3 is Lando Norris. Qualified 2nd, out-qualified his teammate by about 10th. Not quite good enough to be on pole position, and of course without Verstappen's exceptional lap, probably ends up on pole position. Don't know if it would have been enough to win the race, given what we saw later in the Grand Prix with Verstappen basically just overtaking him on pure pace, but to be honest, I felt this was a pretty good Grand Prix by Norris. Had a bit of a scare there in Q2, could have easily gotten knocked out. Started the Grand Prix in like 11th or 12th, but luckily for him, he got that lap in at the end. I think a little bit lucky that his teammate Piastri basically gave him a tow at the end of Q2 to help him get into Q3. And then of course, unlucky to get the slow pit stop, but lucky that he's in a team that is going to such lengths to be fair that they basically asked the 2 drivers to swap them around. And now that lead in the Drivers' Championship is cut from 34 points down to 31. Now, moving on to 2nd and 1st, last 2 spots on our power rankings. I think everyone pretty much knows who's going to be 1st, so we're just going to reveal it now. 2nd, Leclerc, and then of course Max Verstappen. So for Leclerc, I do think he'll be a bit disappointed with 4th, but I don't think he really has anything to be ashamed of. I think he really got the most out of the car. That was clearly, I would say, 3rd best car this weekend. Definitely slower than the the McLarens and the Red Bulls. Or at least Verstappen's Red Bull, I should say. Qualified 4th, again, like I said, out-qualified Hamilton by 1.2 of a second, and then a bit of a lonely race to a 4th place after some excitement. Overtook Piastri in the opening laps, I believe, and then again was a bit of a roadblock for a couple laps there before Piastri kind of just cruised around the outside of him going into turn 1. And then from there, solid race to 4th place. Now, for Max Verstappen, qualified on pole, out-qualified his teammate by about 7/10. Excellent lap there on that very, very trimmed out Red Bull to snatch pole position from the McLarens. I do think the McLarens were still the faster car this weekend, but I think on race pace, I do think it was either equal or maybe slightly better, slightly in favor of Verstappen. And again, having the fact that the tarmac at Monza is relatively high grip because it got resurfaced last year means that tire wear is like almost non-existent in the last couple of years. That's what really helped, Leclerc with his one-stop strategy last year. And again, helped Verstappen here as, tire degradation, tire preservation is really one of the big advantages of the McLaren. So to have that basically negated by the track surface was, again, I think one of the reasons why Verstappen was able to have such a strong Grand Prix this time out. Plus the fact that they basically absolutely nailed the setup of the car for what seems like the first time in quite a while. But yeah, excellent Grand Prix by Verstappen, perfectly executed. The only thing you could possibly, mark him off for was maybe a bit of a slow start, given that Norris had a good start for the first time in what seemed a while. Just didn't matter this time as Verstappen basically overtook him plainly a couple laps later. So there you go. That's my power rankings for the 2025 Italian Grand Prix, and we'll be back with the Singapore Grand Prix in a couple weeks' time. In the meanwhile, I have a couple videos planned, so look forward to those over the next week or so. So thank you so much for watching, and goodbye.